Welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today, we're going to be talking about whether our organizations are as resilient as we believe they are. And I'd like to welcome to the show for his first appearance, Jason Buffington. Jason, welcome to the show.
Alex, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Well, I'm glad you accepted my invitation because recently, what was it, January 30th, there was an article you wrote that was published on Forbes.com. And that was about, our organizations may not be as resilient as we might think they are. And I wanted to reach out and touch base with you on that because so many people these days want to say the organizations are resilient, so their processes are. And you really point out some great information in your article. So I'd like to start out with the first question is where you typed, if you aren't testing, you don't have a plan. You have a hope.
You have a
What did
hope.
you mean?
Yeah, so as a little background, so I have been on the data protection, the IT side of resilience for about 35 years. It's the only thing I've done since even before getting out of school. And so I came up from the first it was about backup, and then it was about restore, and then it was about DR, and now everyone wants to talk about resilience, right? So that is that maturation that I've kind of been through along the way. And so certainly one of the things I've seen over the years, but I had the chance to do some quantitative research on, we should talk about that in a minute, was around how often are they testing? How are those tests going? How are they improving? So I really wanted to kind of understand at scale what does that look like? And sure enough, about a third of organizations that I surveyed don't even do an annual test, right? So I mean, just think about that. So if you're not testing, how do you know how resilient you are? And then beyond that, of those that were testing, the average of those that test was one test every 10 months. And Alex, the good news is nothing changes in IT more than every 10 months. So they should be fine, right?
Oh,
But no, that's the biggest problem is, okay, we're not testing enough. Maybe we're not testing at all, but you're not iterating enough that you can actually improve your resilience posture.
well, that's interesting because I'm surprised the number is that high, considering so much governance and compliance and regulations that are out there right now, and so much oversight is to make sure all this is happening, that
Yeah,
30% would still turn around and say, yeah, we only do it once every 10 months or maybe even
on
more.
average.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's qualify the audience because I think the main part of that particular Forbes article, the article above that, by the way, so that's my second Forbes entry for the year. The first one was around we need to redefine what cyber resilience means, and maybe I can talk you into having me back at another date for that one. But in this particular one, so the survey surveyed 502 folks, and they had to have a primary job responsibility in either business continuity, disaster recovery, crisis or emergency management or information security, right? So these are the folks whose daytime job is resilience. And one of the most interesting things that kind of came out of that was those four disciplines weren't aligned. They weren't aligned within the org. We saw a significant gap between based on where they were hierarchically within their organizations. And so I think a lot of folks, because of that disparity, that distribution of people, they're just optimistically naive, right? They assume that's testing. Surely someone's, testing, right? And no, actually, when you ask 500 folks that are actually responsible for that, they say, no, we're not testing as much as you think.
Well, that kind of leads to one of the other questions I was going to ask that you have a section where, what are the exact words? Distance creates optimism. What you're saying now kind of leads to what you were talking about there.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of doing research at that scale was you get a chance to cut the data in a lot of different directions. And I first thought it was going to be most interesting to cut across the four disciplines, right? And in fact, you can kind of batch up let's call them the less technical parts of resilience, meaning BC and crisis emergency management, with the more techie versions, which is disaster recovery and information security. And I thought, okay, so based on that, that's where the disparity is going to come from. Actually, when you cut it, the gaps actually were broader when you looked hierarchically between those folks who said they were a VP or a C-suite versus those folks who said they were an implementer or they managed implementers. And so what you saw was, in one part of the study, 62% of the executive stakeholders said they could recover at a large scale from either a cyber or DR event. So a large piece of IT in 24 hours or less. 62%, right? When you ask the implementers said the average recovery speed was 2.6 days for the same. The questionnaire actually said, imagine you had to recover 50 servers due to cyber or DR event. How long would that take? As you are further away from the keyboard, there is an optimism that comes into that because they don't understand the nuances and the complexities of bringing up a modern IT infrastructure.
And then, excuse me, if you're not testing and you're not keeping up things up to date, like you talked about earlier on, like nothing ever changes in IT, project management never implements anything new,
Right.
then that 2.6 days could actually be longer.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the other studies, I'm a big fan of some of the research that goes on I won't mention the other brand names, but they measure 8.8 as the average number of days for recovery. The last research project I did in 2024 that was also at scale, it had 1,200 IT leaders on it. Only a third of them, 32%, said they could recover within a business week. Right. So, I mean, so every time you ask the folks that actually put hands on keyboard or actually do that testing, you get a measure in days. When you ask senior leaders that are a little further away, you get a measure in hours. And I think that's one of the big challenges. One of the things that we actually looked to validate that was in the survey, I asked, how engaged are you with senior leadership, with the C-suite, with the board? Because if you're not bubbling up, hey, we got a 52% SLA on our last test, right? That's well, the fact that you're actually bubbling that up is good, right? If you're not bubbling that stuff up, then they're going to be optimistically naive.
Is that because they create a culture where they don't accept bad news like that?
I think that's certainly part of it. So whenever I get on a stage, one of the favorite things I try to, you get that 30 seconds at the end of the talk to say, hey, what's the one thing you haven't talked about yet? Here's my one thing. We need to develop more of a culture that celebrates red X's instead of green check marks, right? When you're celebrating green check marks, whether it's on audits and tests, you're not going to look very hard because you're looking for green check marks. What we need to be doing is creating a culture where we celebrate red X's, where we say, I am so glad that you found that problem, right? Because if you're using orchestrated workflows, so you have a repeatable process, you're not waiting on humans, then if a workflow results in a red X, you know what to improve. And between that and iterations, now we can actually get those SLAs from 52 to 67 to 83, right? That's how you actually get more efficient. But if the culture isn't celebrating red X's on this stuff, they're not going to bubble it up. They don't want bad news. And then here's my punchline. If you're only looking for green check marks, you'll find them when you want them and not when you need them.
Exactly. I think that also comes down to, unfortunately, so a lot of places still do this. Their test pass or fail.
Yeah.
Pass is all the green check marks,
Yeah.
and ignore the red X's. Don't tell anyone about that. We'll deal with that separately. But
Sure.
I've always thought, no, it's not pass or fail. Let's find those gaps, as many as we can, in a controlled circumstance, rather than trying to figure it out when a real event comes. And unfortunately, people keep thinking pass or fail. The more red X's, oh, we failed. And then that demoralizes people.
Yeah, I have three young adult children, and I used to make the joke because I've been in the space a long time. If my daughter came home from college with a 52 on her last final, we would have a talking to, right? That is a different kind of math. But when you say, hey, this particular workload doesn't change very often, we have that from the change control logs, and it's gotten green checks for the last two passes, then I'm not going to focus on that because I'm going to count on that probably going well. I'm going to focus on all the red X's, and my commitment is each iteration, some of those red X's need to turn into green checks. Right. But it helps me focus on where the areas I need to improve. And what we should be celebrating is not the 52 versus 67. What we should be celebrating is the plus 15 test to test. Right. That's how you iterate on the testing and what the culture should be celebrating for.
Yeah. I know you talked about the research. Are you doing more research, or was this all just focused on this one area? Is there more research
No.
you're doing?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for that. So the next two projects I'm spinning up, So I believe the best part of managed services is the expertise as a service, not necessarily the tech that comes with that. And since I come from the IT lens, I'm currently working on a project where we're measuring backup as a service, DR as a service, and cyber resilience. So BAS to DRAS to CRAS, and what's the influence of managed service providers on that? One of the things we found in this research was how often an organization that actually was mature in its resilience strategy was leveraging third-party service providers for backup, for DR, for incident response. So looking at that question stimulated, okay, let's go find out what the difference is between good and great for managed services. And then the other project that actually spins up next quarter is looking at AI, because can't have a conversation in 2026 doesn't talk about AI. But I'm going to look at AI as in resilience, not necessarily from how AI benefits the resilience professional, but from a what are the AI capabilities in the backup DR cyber continuum that buyers and customers really want? And oh, by the way, if we're going to rely on AI for all the normal jobs that we do moving forward, how are you ensuring the resilience of the AI platforms themselves? Right? Alex, you and I talk about, if you're relying on a on a technology as part of your business process, you got to secure it, right? You got to make sure it's durable. If you're going to rely on AI as part of your day job, how are you ensuring it's durable? And so those are the next two projects that are kind of coming up along the way.
Oh, great. Any final thoughts on your article here with Forbes?
Well, I've had the privilege of dropping a couple. I'm going to drop one about every 4 to 6 weeks. This next one coming up in March is on four IT obstacles to resilience. And so I'm going to unpack four other IT trends, each of which can either be of benefit or a cause of jeopardy towards your overall resilience posture. So be looking for that one as well.
We'll have to get you back on to talk about that for sure.
Thanks for having me today. I hope folks got something out of it.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Jason. Really appreciate it.
Take care.